In the summer of 2019, renovation workers in Millstone, Vermont, made a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about this quiet New England town. Behind a false wall in the basement of the old town hall, they found a cache of documents that had been sealed for over a century and a half. Among these papers were meeting minutes, ritualistic texts, and correspondence that revealed the existence of a secret society that had operated in the shadows of respectability for decades. The documents spoke of trials, punishments, and blood oaths administered in the very basement where they were discovered. They told of the Millstone Brotherhood, an organization that masqueraded as a moral improvement society while conducting proceedings that would horrify modern sensibilities. What emerged from these yellowed pages was evidence of a systematic campaign of psychological terror and social control that reached its peak in the winter of 1874, when a series of events would shake the town to its core and leave a trail of mysterious deaths that authorities would spend generations trying to cover up. The story that follows has been reconstructed from these newly discovered documents, contemporary newspaper accounts, personal diaries, and testimony from descendants who finally felt safe enough to speak about family secrets that had been buried for nearly 150 years. The town of Millstone in 1874 was a community caught between two worlds. With a population barely exceeding 800 souls, it sat nestled in a valley 23 miles southeast of Montpelier, surrounded by the rolling hills that would burst into spectacular color each autumn. The town had been established in 1792 by Presbyterian settlers who brought with them a stern moral code and an unwavering belief in divine providence. By the 1870s, however, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform even remote Vermont communities. A small textile mill had been constructed along Crow Creek in 1868, bringing with it a modest influx of Irish and French-Canadian workers who settled in a cluster of boarding houses on the east side of town. This demographic shift created tensions that would prove fertile ground for the activities of the Millstone Brotherhood. The town's economy relied heavily on agriculture, with dairy farming and lumber providing the primary sources of income for most families. The center of civic life was the imposing brick town hall, completed in 1861 with federal funds allocated as part of a rural improvement program. The building's basement, originally intended for storage and occasional community gatherings, would become the site of proceedings that defied both law and human decency. Religious life in Millstone was dominated by the First Presbyterian Church, led since 1869 by Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a stern man in his 50s, whose sermons often focused on the themes of moral purity and divine judgment. It was Blackwood who would become instrumental in legitimizing the Brotherhood's activities, providing religious justification for their increasingly extreme methods of social control. The town's political leadership was concentrated in the hands of a few prominent families who had held positions of authority since the settlement's founding. Chief among these was Judge Cornelius Ashford, a man whose family had arrived with the original Presbyterian settlers and who had served as the town's principal magistrate since 1858. Judge Ashford was a figure who commanded both respect and fear in equal measure. Standing well over 6 feet tall with penetrating gray eyes and a meticulously groomed beard, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a room with a single glance. Born in 1821 to one of Millstone's founding families, Ashford had been educated at Middlebury College before returning to his hometown to practice law and eventually assume the bench. By all outward appearances, he was a pillar of the community, a man devoted to upholding the moral and legal standards that had guided Millstone since its inception. However, the documents discovered in 2019 reveal a far more complex and disturbing picture of Judge Ashford's true nature. It was Ashford who founded the Millstone Brotherhood in the spring of 1870, initially presenting it as a voluntary association dedicated to promoting moral improvement and social harmony. The organization's stated goals were admirable: to combat the rise of vice and immorality that seemed to accompany the town's modest industrial growth, to provide guidance and support for community members struggling with personal failings, and to preserve the Christian values upon which Millstone had been founded. The Brotherhood held its first official meeting on May 15, 1870, in the basement of the town hall, with 12 founding members in attendance. These men represented the cream of Millstone society: Judge Ashford himself, Reverend Blackwood, Dr. Ezra Whitmore, mill owner Thomas Hartwell, banker Samuel Morrison, and 7 other respected citizens whose names appeared regularly in church records and town meeting minutes. What began as weekly discussions about community improvement and moral guidance would gradually evolve into something far more sinister. The Brotherhood's meeting minutes, written in Ashford's precise handwriting, show a progressive shift from theoretical discussions about morality to practical interventions in the lives of community members. By the end of 1870, the organization had established what they called a moral court, empowered to investigate allegations of wrongdoing and to prescribe appropriate remedies. The language used in these early documents is revealing in its presumption of authority and its casual dismissal of individual rights and dignity. The secret trials conducted by the Millstone Brotherhood in the basement of the town hall represented a perversion of justice that would have been shocking even by the standards of the 1870s. The proceedings, meticulously documented in the Brotherhood's own records, began in earnest in January 1871 and continued with increasing frequency and severity over the next 4 years. The basement had been modified specifically for these purposes, with the installation of a raised platform at one end, where Judge Ashford would preside, flanked by other senior members of the Brotherhood. Wooden benches were arranged in rows facing this makeshift tribunal, while a single chair sat isolated in the center of the room where the accused would be forced to stand trial. The walls were lined with oil lamps that cast flickering shadows, creating an atmosphere of theatrical menace that was clearly intended to intimidate and disorient those brought before the Brotherhood's judgment. The process by which individuals came to face these trials was itself a masterpiece of manipulation and social control. Any member of the Brotherhood could bring accusations against a community member, regardless of the nature of the alleged offense or the quality of evidence supporting the charge. The accusations ranged from serious moral failings, such as adultery or theft, to minor infractions like public drunkenness, failure to attend church regularly, or even expressing opinions that the Brotherhood deemed inappropriate or dangerous. Once an accusation was made, the target would receive a formal summons, delivered by Brotherhood members who made it clear that attendance was not optional. The psychological pressure applied to ensure compliance was considerable, involving threats to the individual's livelihood, social standing, and even physical safety. Those who attempted to ignore the summons faced escalating consequences that often included economic boycotts, social ostracism, and in some cases acts of vandalism or intimidation directed at their property or family members. The trials themselves followed a grotesque parody of legal procedure that combined elements of Puritan confession culture with techniques of psychological manipulation that would not be out of place in a modern interrogation manual. The accused was required to stand in the center of the room while Brotherhood members seated in the surrounding benches hurled questions, accusations, and moral condemnations. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, and no opportunity to call witnesses in one's defense. The proceedings were designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to break down the psychological defenses of the accused and force them to confess not only to the specific charges brought against them, but to a comprehensive catalogue of moral and spiritual failings. The Brotherhood had developed what they called the Manual of Moral Correction, a handbook that outlined their philosophy and methods in chilling detail. This document, written primarily by Judge Ashford with contributions from Reverend Blackwood, provided justification for their activities by claiming divine authority for their mission and moral superiority over civil law and constitutional protections. The Manual of Moral Correction revealed the true scope of the Brotherhood's ambitions and the depths of their moral corruption. The document, running to nearly 200 handwritten pages, began with a theological justification for the organization's activities that twisted Christian doctrine to support their campaign of terror. According to Ashford's reasoning, the Brotherhood had been chosen by divine providence to serve as instruments of God's judgment on earth, empowered to cleanse their community of moral impurity through whatever means they deemed necessary. The manual explicitly rejected the authority of civil law when it conflicted with what the Brotherhood perceived as divine commandment, arguing that man-made legal protections were obstacles to the achievement of true moral purity. The document outlined a complex hierarchy within the organization, with different levels of membership corresponding to different degrees of initiation and authority. At the apex stood the inner circle, consisting of Judge Ashford, Reverend Blackwood, and 3 other founding members who had proven their commitment through what the manual euphemistically termed acts of sacred courage. Below them were the guardians, responsible for identifying targets for moral correction and gathering evidence of wrongdoing. At the base of the hierarchy were the witnesses, newer members whose primary function was to observe trials and provide moral support for the proceedings. The manual detailed specific rituals and ceremonies that bound members to the organization and to each other through increasingly elaborate oaths and demonstrations of loyalty. New members were required to undergo an initiation ceremony that took place in the basement of the town hall under the light of 13 black candles arranged in a circle around the room. The ritual began with the recitation of the Brotherhood's creed, a twisted version of Christian doctrine that emphasized judgment, punishment, and the necessity of moral violence in service of divine will. Initiates were then required to take what the manual called the blood oath of sacred brotherhood, a ceremony that involved the ritual cutting of the palm with a ceremonial knife and the mixing of blood in a common chalice. The initiate would drink from this chalice while reciting a lengthy pledge of absolute loyalty to the Brotherhood and its mission, promising to place the organization's goals above all other considerations, including family, law, and personal conscience. The psychological techniques employed during trials were outlined in meticulous detail, revealing a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that was remarkable for its time and terrifying in its application. The manual described methods for identifying psychological vulnerabilities in the accused, techniques for exploiting fears and insecurities to break down resistance, and strategies for using social pressure and group dynamics to isolate and overwhelm the target. The document made clear that the goal of these proceedings was not justice in any conventional sense, but the complete psychological submission of the accused to the will of the Brotherhood. The manual also revealed the existence of what they called purification rituals, extreme forms of punishment reserved for those who refused to confess or who challenged the Brotherhood's authority. These rituals, described in language that combined religious imagery with barely concealed sadism, involved various forms of physical and psychological torture that were justified as necessary for the spiritual cleansing of the subject. The winter of 1873 marked a turning point in the Brotherhood's reign of terror, as their activities began to attract attention from outside the tightly controlled community of Millstone. The first sign of trouble came in December, when Margaret O'Brien, the wife of an Irish mill worker, failed to return home after receiving a summons to appear before the Brotherhood's tribunal. Mrs. O'Brien had been accused of adultery by a neighbor who claimed to have seen her speaking intimately with a traveling salesman outside the general store. Her husband, Patrick, a man known for his quick temper and fierce loyalty to his family, demanded answers from Judge Ashford and other town officials when his wife failed to return home after 3 days. The official response was that Margaret had left town voluntarily after confessing to her sins and accepting the Brotherhood's judgment, but Patrick's inquiries revealed disturbing inconsistencies in this account. Several witnesses reported seeing Brotherhood members escorting Margaret toward the town hall on the evening she disappeared, but no one had seen her leave. More troubling still, her personal belongings remained in the family's boarding house room, and she had made no arrangements for the care of her 2 young children. Patrick's increasingly frantic efforts to locate his wife led him to question other community members who had been subjected to Brotherhood trials, and what he learned convinced him that something far more sinister than moral correction was taking place in the town hall basement. His investigation revealed a pattern of mysterious disappearances among those who had challenged the Brotherhood's authority or refused to submit to their judgment. At least 7 people had vanished under similar circumstances over the previous 2 years, always following a summons to appear before the tribunal, always with official explanations that blamed the victims themselves for their fate. The disappearances included both men and women from various backgrounds, but they shared certain characteristics that suggested a deliberate pattern of targeting. Most had been relatively new to the community, lacking the deep family connections that might have provided protection against the Brotherhood's activities. Many were immigrants or members of religious minorities who already occupied marginal positions in Millstone's social hierarchy. All had been accused of moral offenses that, while perhaps embarrassing or socially awkward, hardly justified the extreme responses they had apparently received. Patrick O'Brien's efforts to investigate his wife's disappearance brought him into contact with other family members who had suffered similar losses, and together they began to piece together evidence of the Brotherhood's crimes. Their informal investigation revealed the existence of what appeared to be a systematic campaign of murder, disguised as moral correction, with victims being eliminated when they refused to submit to the organization's will or when their continued presence threatened to expose the true nature of the Brotherhood's activities. The case that would ultimately expose the full extent of the Brotherhood's crimes began on February 14, 1874, when 19-year-old Timothy Marsh received a summons to appear before their tribunal on charges of blasphemy and moral corruption. Timothy was the son of a local farmer who had fallen on hard times, and he had recently begun working at the textile mill to help support his family. The specific charges against him stemmed from comments he had allegedly made, questioning the authority of Reverend Blackwood's interpretation of Scripture and expressing doubts about the necessity of some of the more austere moral restrictions imposed by the town's religious leadership. Under normal circumstances, such religious questioning might have resulted in a stern lecture from the Reverend or perhaps temporary social disapproval, but the Brotherhood had identified Timothy as a potential threat to their authority due to his intelligence, articulateness, and growing influence among the younger members of the community. The trial of Timothy Marsh, documented in unusual detail due to the presence of a Brotherhood member who later defected and preserved his notes, revealed the full horror of the organization's proceedings. The young man was brought to the basement of the town hall on the evening of February 16th, where he faced a tribunal of 12 Brotherhood members arranged in their ceremonial positions. Judge Ashford, wearing a black robe specially commissioned for these proceedings, presided from his elevated position while the other members formed a semicircle around their victim. The trial began with the reading of charges, delivered in language that transformed minor acts of youthful skepticism into evidence of dangerous moral corruption that threatened the very foundations of the community. Timothy's initial attempts to defend himself were met with increasingly hostile questioning, designed to confuse and intimidate rather than to elicit truth. When he continued to maintain his innocence and to challenge the legitimacy of the proceedings, the Brotherhood implemented what their manual termed intensive moral correction, a process that combined sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and increasingly explicit threats of violence. The surviving account describes how Timothy was forced to remain standing throughout the night, while Brotherhood members took turns subjecting him to verbal abuse, personal attacks, and demands for confession that became increasingly irrational and impossible to satisfy. By dawn, the young man had been reduced to a state of physical and emotional collapse, but he continued to refuse the comprehensive confession that the Brotherhood demanded. The decision to escalate to what they called ultimate purification was made by Judge Ashford himself, who declared that Timothy's continued resistance proved the depth of his spiritual corruption and the necessity of extreme measures to save his soul. What happened next was documented with clinical precision by the Brotherhood member who would later provide testimony to investigators, creating a record of calculated murder that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. The murder of Timothy Marsh on February 17, 1874, represented the culmination of the Brotherhood's descent into absolute moral corruption. The young man's body was discovered 3 days later by children playing near Crow Creek, approximately 2 miles downstream from the town hall. The official cause of death was ruled to be accidental drowning, with local authorities suggesting that Timothy had been drinking heavily and had fallen into the creek during the night. However, the testimony provided years later by the defecting Brotherhood member painted a very different picture of Timothy's final hours. According to this witness, whose identity was protected by investigators, but whose account was corroborated by physical evidence, Timothy had been subjected to what the Brotherhood termed a purification ritual, designed to cleanse his soul through suffering. The ritual, conducted in the basement of the town hall, involved systematic torture that began with psychological torment and escalated to increasingly severe physical abuse. The Brotherhood members, convinced of their moral authority and divine mandate, documented these proceedings with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all their activities. The witness described how Timothy was bound to a specially constructed wooden frame, while Brotherhood members took turns administering what they believed to be spiritually corrective punishment. The young man's cries for mercy were interpreted as evidence of his spiritual awakening, while his continued refusal to confess to crimes he had not committed was seen as proof of his need for additional purification. The ritual continued throughout the night, with Brotherhood members maintaining that they were performing a sacred duty that would ultimately save Timothy's soul and protect the community from moral contamination. When Timothy finally succumbed to his injuries in the early hours of February 17th, the Brotherhood faced the practical problem of disposing of evidence while maintaining their public facade of moral authority. Judge Ashford made the decision to stage the scene at Crow Creek, believing that the community's respect for his judgment would prevent any serious investigation into the circumstances of Timothy's death. The body was transported to the creek under cover of darkness, positioned to suggest accidental drowning, and discovered by children whose innocent testimony would provide perfect cover for the crime. The Brotherhood's confidence in their ability to control the narrative proved well-founded initially. As local authorities accepted the official explanation without serious question, and Timothy's family, devastated by their loss and lacking political influence, were unable to challenge the verdict. The aftermath of Timothy Marsh's murder marked the beginning of the end for the Millstone Brotherhood, though their downfall would prove to be a slow and partially concealed process that protected many of the participants from full accountability for their crimes. The first crack in their facade of respectability came from an unexpected source. A letter published anonymously in the Vermont Chronicle, a newspaper based in Windsor that occasionally covered news from smaller communities throughout the state. The letter, dated March 3, 1874, provided a detailed account of the Brotherhood's activities that was so shocking and specific that it could not be dismissed as mere rumor or gossip. The author, who identified himself only as a witness to evil, described the secret trials, the psychological torture, and the systematic intimidation that had terrorized Millstone for nearly 4 years. The letter included specific details about the basement chamber, the Brotherhood's organizational structure, and the fate of several missing persons that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the organization's activities. Most damning of all, the letter provided a detailed account of Timothy Marsh's murder that contradicted the official verdict of accidental death and implicated several prominent community members by name. The publication of this letter created a sensation that reached far beyond the borders of Millstone, attracting the attention of state authorities who had previously been unaware of the situation. The response from within Millstone itself was swift and decisive, as the Brotherhood launched a campaign to discredit the letter and identify its author. Judge Ashford publicly dismissed the allegations as the product of a disturbed mind, while Reverend Blackwood delivered a series of sermons condemning the spread of malicious rumors and calling upon the faithful to resist the forces of evil that sought to destroy their community. The Brotherhood's supporters, who still represented a significant portion of the town's population, rallied to defend their leaders and to maintain the conspiracy of silence that had protected the organization for so long. However, the letter had planted seeds of doubt that would prove impossible to eradicate completely, and families who had lost loved ones to the Brotherhood's activities began to speak more openly about their suspicions and fears. The investigation that followed was hampered by the Brotherhood's influence over local law enforcement and their ability to intimidate potential witnesses. But state authorities eventually assembled enough evidence to warrant official action. The key breakthrough came when the Brotherhood member who had documented Timothy Marsh's murder finally broke his oath of silence and provided detailed testimony about the organization's crimes. This witness, whose name has never been publicly revealed, had been horrified by what he had witnessed and had gradually become convinced that the Brotherhood's actions were not divinely inspired moral correction, but simple murder motivated by the desire for power and control. The official investigation into the Millstone Brotherhood began in earnest in May 1874, when Vermont Attorney General Jonathan Miller dispatched a team of investigators to examine the allegations contained in the anonymous letter and to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. The investigation was led by Detective Inspector William Hayes, a former Union Army officer who had gained a reputation for his ability to uncover corruption in small communities where local officials might be compromised. Hayes arrived in Millstone on May 15th, exactly 4 years after the Brotherhood had held its first official meeting in the town hall basement. What he found was a community divided between those who continued to support Judge Ashford and his associates, and a growing number of residents who were finally willing to speak about the climate of fear that had dominated their lives for nearly half a decade. The investigation faced immediate obstacles as key witnesses were reluctant to come forward, and physical evidence had been carefully concealed or destroyed by the Brotherhood's leadership. The basement chamber had been thoroughly cleaned and returned to its original configuration as a simple storage and meeting space, with no obvious signs of the horrors that had taken place there. Judge Ashford and other Brotherhood leaders maintained their innocence and characterized the investigation as a politically motivated attack on their community's traditional values and moral standards. They portrayed themselves as victims of a malicious campaign designed to destroy their reputations and undermine the moral foundations of their society. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Detective Inspector Hayes was contacted by the Brotherhood member who had witnessed Timothy Marsh's murder and who had finally decided to break his oath of silence. This witness, referred to in official documents only as Source A, provided detailed information about the Brotherhood's activities, including the location of documents that had been hidden in various locations around Millstone. Armed with this information, investigators were able to recover significant portions of the Brotherhood's records, including meeting minutes, correspondence, and most importantly, the Manual of Moral Correction that provided clear evidence of the organization's criminal intent and methods. The recovered documents painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that went far beyond the single murder of Timothy Marsh, revealing evidence of multiple killings, extensive intimidation campaigns, and a conspiracy that had corrupted the basic institutions of law and order in Millstone. Based on this evidence, arrest warrants were issued for Judge Ashford, Reverend Blackwood, and 7 other Brotherhood members on charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to kidnapping and assault. However, the process of bringing these men to justice would prove to be far more complicated than investigators had anticipated. The arrest of Judge Ashford and his co-conspirators in June 1874 should have marked the end of the Millstone Brotherhood's reign of terror, but the reality proved far more complex and ultimately frustrating for those seeking justice. Judge Ashford, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, never stood trial for his crimes. On the night of June 18th, just hours before he was scheduled to be transported to the state capitol for formal arraignment, he was found dead in his jail cell under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging, with authorities claiming that Ashford had fashioned a noose from his bedsheets and suspended himself from the cell's window bars. However, several aspects of the scene troubled investigators, including the positioning of the body, the nature of the ligature marks, and the fact that Ashford had expressed confidence in his ability to beat the charges and had been making plans for his legal defense. The deaths did not end with Judge Ashford. Over the following 6 months, 4 other Brotherhood members died under various circumstances that ranged from apparently accidental to obviously suspicious. Reverend Blackwood succumbed to what was described as a sudden heart attack while delivering a sermon about divine justice and the persecution of the righteous. Dr. Ezra Whitmore died in a carriage accident when his horse was spooked by unknown causes and threw him from his seat onto the rocky ground beside the road. Mill owner Thomas Hartwell was found drowned in the same section of Crow Creek where Timothy Marsh's body had been discovered, leading to inevitable comparisons and renewed speculation about the true circumstances of both deaths. The pattern of deaths among Brotherhood members was so consistent and convenient for those seeking to avoid prosecution that it became impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. The surviving members of the organization, who had managed to evade arrest, began leaving Millstone in significant numbers, relocating to distant communities where their involvement in the Brotherhood's activities was unknown. The town itself began to show the strain of the scandal. As businesses failed, property values collapsed, and longtime residents fled to escape the stigma associated with their community's dark secrets. The investigation officially concluded in December 1874 with the release of a report that documented the Brotherhood's crimes in considerable detail, but offered little satisfaction to those seeking justice for the victims. The report confirmed that at least 12 people had been murdered by the Brotherhood over a 4-year period, with additional victims who had been subjected to torture, kidnapping, and severe psychological abuse. The investigation had been hampered by the deaths of key suspects, the destruction of evidence, and the continuing reluctance of many witnesses to come forward with testimony that might implicate friends and neighbors in the conspiracy. The basement of the town hall was officially sealed by order of the state authorities, with the entrance bricked over and access prohibited to prevent the chamber from becoming a morbid curiosity or a site of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the Brotherhood's activities. The efforts to suppress knowledge of the Millstone Brotherhood's crimes began almost immediately after the official investigation concluded, as community leaders and state authorities alike recognized the potential damage that continued publicity might cause to Vermont's reputation and to the dozens of innocent residents who had played no role in the conspiracy. The decision was made at the highest levels of state government to classify many of the investigation's findings and to discourage further media coverage of the case. Newspaper editors throughout New England were quietly contacted by officials who requested their cooperation in allowing the story to fade from public attention, arguing that continued coverage would only serve to sensationalize violence and to damage innocent people who had suffered enough. The strategy proved remarkably effective, as coverage of the Brotherhood case virtually disappeared from newspapers by early 1875, and few people outside of Vermont ever learned the full extent of what had occurred in Millstone. Within the town itself, a conspiracy of silence developed that was enforced through a combination of shame, fear, and genuine desire to move beyond the trauma that had divided the community. Families who had lost loved ones to the Brotherhood were quietly compensated through a fund established by the state government, with the understanding that they would not seek further publicity or pursue additional legal action. New residents were actively recruited to replace those who had fled, and within a few years, the majority of Millstone's population consisted of people who had no direct knowledge of the Brotherhood's activities and little interest in investigating the town's dark history. The official records of the investigation were transferred to the state archives in Montpelier, where they were classified as restricted materials, accessible only to qualified researchers who could demonstrate a legitimate academic or legal purpose for examining them. The town hall basement remained sealed, and the building itself was eventually demolished in 1892 as part of a civic improvement project that constructed a new municipal building on a different site. However, the efforts to erase the Brotherhood's legacy were not entirely successful, as rumors and family stories continued to circulate among longtime residents who remembered the fear that had once gripped their community. These stories, passed down through generations and embellished with each telling, created a local folklore that preserved certain elements of the truth even as official sources remained silent. The persistence of these underground narratives would prove crucial decades later, when renewed interest in the case finally brought the full story to light. In 1936, 62 years after the Brotherhood's crimes had been officially forgotten, a descendant of one of the original investigators attempted to reopen the case and to bring the full truth about the organization's activities to public attention. Harold Morrison, the great-nephew of banker Samuel Morrison, who had been one of the Brotherhood's founding members, had inherited a cache of family documents that included correspondence and diary entries that provided additional evidence of the conspiracy. Harold, a journalist working for the Burlington Free Press, had spent months researching the case and preparing a comprehensive exposé that would have revealed details about the Brotherhood that had never been made public. His investigation had uncovered evidence that the organization had not been completely destroyed in 1874, but had simply gone deeper underground and continued to operate in modified form well into the 1880s. Harold's research had also revealed connections between the Millstone Brotherhood and similar organizations in other New England communities, suggesting that the conspiracy had been part of a broader network of secret societies that had used the guise of moral improvement to pursue criminal activities. On November 12, 1936, just 2 days before his planned publication of the story, Harold Morrison was found dead in his Burlington apartment under circumstances that police ruled accidental, but that bore disturbing similarities to the deaths of Brotherhood members 60 years earlier. The official investigation into Harold's death was perfunctory, concluding that he had suffered a fatal fall down his apartment building's staircase after apparently losing his footing on the polished wooden steps. However, the timing of his death, combined with the fact that his research materials had been thoroughly ransacked and many key documents removed, suggested a more sinister explanation that investigators either could not or would not pursue. Harold's death effectively ended serious attempts to re-examine the Brotherhood case for another generation, as other researchers who had shown interest in the topic received subtle but clear warnings about the dangers of pursuing certain lines of inquiry. The rediscovery of the Millstone Brotherhood's crimes in 2019 has reopened questions that have remained unanswered for nearly 150 years and has forced historians to reconsider their understanding of social control and religious extremism in post-Civil War America. The documents found during the town hall renovation have provided unprecedented insight into the mindset and methods of a criminal organization that successfully masqueraded as a moral improvement society while conducting a systematic campaign of terror against its own community. The psychological sophistication of the Brotherhood's techniques, the complexity of their organizational structure, and the extent of their influence over local institutions suggest that the Millstone case may not have been an isolated incident, but rather an example of a broader phenomenon that historians have failed to recognize or investigate adequately. The parallels between the Brotherhood's activities and those of other extremist organizations throughout American history are striking and disturbing, raising questions about the conditions that allow such groups to emerge and flourish in seemingly normal communities. The case also highlights the ease with which official records can be suppressed and public memory manipulated when powerful interests align to conceal uncomfortable truths. Perhaps most unsettling of all, the investigation into the Brotherhood's activities has revealed evidence that the organization may not have been completely destroyed in 1874 as previously believed. Documents found in the town hall basement include references to affiliated groups in other communities and to plans for the continuation of the Brotherhood's mission through less conspicuous means. The mysterious deaths of both Judge Ashford and Harold Morrison, separated by more than 60 years, but sharing suspicious circumstances, suggest the possibility that elements of the original conspiracy survived and continued to protect themselves through violence when necessary. Current residents of Millstone, now a picturesque tourist destination known for its fall foliage and quaint New England charm, have been largely unaware of their community's dark history until the recent revelations. The town's modern leaders have expressed shock and dismay at the discoveries, emphasizing that today's Millstone bears no resemblance to the community that harbored the Brotherhood's activities. However, some longtime residents have quietly acknowledged that certain families in the area have always been regarded with a mixture of respect and fear that they had never fully understood until now. The basement chamber where the Brotherhood conducted their trials has been carefully excavated and documented by forensic archaeologists who have confirmed many of the details described in the organization's own records. Physical evidence recovered from the site, including human remains, ritual implements, and additional documents, has provided chilling confirmation of the horrors that took place in that underground chamber. As investigators continue to examine the newly discovered materials, they have uncovered references to other sites in Vermont and neighboring states where similar activities may have occurred, raising the possibility that the Millstone Brotherhood was part of a much larger network of criminal organizations that has remained hidden from historical scrutiny. The investigation continues, But the questions it has raised about the nature of American society in the post-Civil War era and the ease with which extremist groups can operate within seemingly normal communities remain as relevant today as they were in 1874. The legacy of the Millstone Brotherhood serves as a disturbing reminder that the greatest threats to human dignity and safety often come not from obvious enemies, but from those who claim moral authority and divine mandate for their actions, and that the price of freedom and security is eternal vigilance against those who would use the language of virtue to justify acts of unspeakable evil.